Imagine waking up in the morning, going to work at a government office, and your main task for the day is figuring out how to inflict the maximum pain on a person without killing them. It sounds like the plot of a horror movie, doesn't it? But this was an ordinary workday for many officials at the court of King Henry VIII in the first half of the 16th century. Every practice well discussed today was not only completely legal in Tudor England, but seen as necessary to maintain order. What we now see as terrible crimes against humanity back then felt like a natural part of state governance. Why is this important to us now? Because understanding how far a society can go in normalizing cruelty helps us think about where our ethical boundaries actually lie. The court of Henry VIII isn't just a curious historical oddity. It acts as a laboratory for human nature under absolute power. 16th century Tudor England was a society where the personal will of the monarch had the force of law. Henry VIII ruled from 1509 to 1547, and during his reign, his court became a symbol of both luxury and unprecedented brutality. It was a time of religious upheavals, political intrigue, and constant power struggles, where a single life was worth no more than the king's mood. Torture in the Tower, when pain became justice. Let's start with something we now define as a crime against humanity: the systematic use of torture. Inside the Tower of London, there was an entire industry devoted to extracting confessions through pain. It wasn't merely tolerated, it was encouraged by royal authority. The main specialist in torture under Henry VIII was Richard Topcliffe, a man contemporaries called the Soul Hunter. Topcliffe didn't just follow orders, he perfected methods, coming up with new ways to cause pain. His arsenal included the rack, the jailer's daughter special manacles that squeeze the head, and many other devices whose names sound like they belong in a museum of horrors. But the truly terrifying part wasn't the tools themselves, it was how mundane torture became. There are detailed records of how Catholic priests, Protestant preachers, political rivals, and even ordinary city dwellers suspected of being untrustworthy were tortured. Topcliffe alone took part in over 100 recorded cases, a number that only includes officially documented episodes. Modern researchers analyzing the Tower's archives found that torture was used not just to obtain confessions, but as a psychological weapon to spread fear. People were often tortured in front of their family or associates to break the collective will of entire groups. Historian John Bellamy, in his work The Tudor Law of Treason, notes that the effectiveness of torture wasn't judged by the number of confessions, but by the level of fear it spread in society. What's especially cynical is how many tortures took place in front of royal advisors or even invited guests. Suffering literally became a show for the elite. There's evidence that noble ladies sat in on torture sessions and chatted about which methods were most effective, as if they were wine tasting. What makes this especially terrible from a modern perspective is its pseudo-legal character. Torture wasn't vigilante justice or just personal sadism, it was a fully formal part of the justice system, with procedures and hierarchies of responsibility. There were even instruction manuals about how to apply different kinds of torture, based on the victim's social status and the charges against them. Public executions, when death was public entertainment. If torture took place behind the Tower's walls, public executions became the most popular spectacle in 16th century London. Today, it's hard to imagine families watching the slow, painful deaths of other people for entertainment, but that's what happened during Henry VIII's era. Tyburn Square, where most executions took place, brought together up to 10,000 spectators on execution days, more than fill many modern stadiums. People came with their families, brought picnic food, and vendors sold refreshments and souvenirs. It felt more like a festival than a place where lives ended. The most popular format was hanging, drawing, and quartering, a punishment that could last half an hour. The condemned was first hanged, but not to death, then cut down, disemboweled, and finally their body was cut into pieces. This all happened in front of the crowd, who would comment, cheer the executioner on, or judge the victim's behavior. Historian Peter Linebaugh, in The London Hanged, points out that executions were not just entertainment, but a tool of social control. The authorities made executions as dramatic and horrible as possible to frighten potential criminals. But there's a paradox. Instead of creating fear, executions often turned into massive carnivals where people let out their emotions, sometimes even criticizing the government. Burning alive was especially brutal and reserved mainly for women accused of heresy or adultery. Protestant preacher Anne Askew, for example, was burned in 1546 after torture so severe she had to be carried to her death on a stretcher. Thousands of onlookers came to see her die like it was a public event. Perhaps the most cynical part was how the whole system became commercialized. The best spots to watch executions were rented out. There were even season passes for regular visitors, and sellers had to pay an extra tax to sell goods on execution days. Someone's death turned into a business project with carefully calculated profit margins. Modern psychologists studying the phenomenon believe these events acted as release valves for social tension. In a society where most people lived in severe poverty and had no rights, seeing the death of enemies of the state created a sense, however false, of power and justice. The crowd could see themselves as judge and executioner, even though they had no real freedom. One detail stands out. Children made up a huge part of these audiences. Parents brought their kids to executions on purpose, treating it as a moral lesson. This is what happens to bad people. Eyewitness accounts describe children playing executions in alleys, staging what they'd seen with dolls or toys. A whole generation grew up with the idea that a public killing was not just normal but educational. Child marriages and forced unions, life as a pawn in a dynasty. Today, even mentioning marriage with minors causes outrage. Everyone knows a child cannot make such decisions. But in 16th century England, children from noble and wealthy families became pawns in the giant chess match of the throne. At Henry VIII's court, being a child was no barrier to marriage. 7, 9, and barely teenage children became the stakes in political alliances. Mary Tudor later, Queen Mary I, was betrothed at age 2 to the son of the French king. These alliances happened with zero regard for the children's wishes. Parents, or rather the monarch and his advisors, decided everything. It was all about calculation and gain. In some cases, physical marriage, meaning actual cohabitation, was delayed until a suitable age, but what counted as suitable was elastic. There are documented cases of girls married at under 12. Catholic and Protestant sources agree. Child marriages in Tudor England were political, first and foremost. Sometimes these unions led to tragedy. Girls were married off to men 20 or 30 years older and died young from early pregnancies or psychological pressure. Today, such practices would instantly be seen as crimes, forced marriage, and abuse. For members of the court, such alliances seemed normal. Children were shown off at court balls, dressed up and presented to their future spouses, sometimes literally at the feet of the king for approval. Henry VIII himself saw his daughters as diplomatic assets. Notes about Princess Elizabeth show that, when she was just over 8, marriage negotiations started with several European dynasties. Why does this matter to us today? Imagine your fate, career, and family life being set at birth, with any resistance meaning punishment for your entire family. Being a tool isn't just a metaphor here, it was reality. The myth that only royal families practice child marriage falls apart under modern research. Archival documents show such marriages happen, even if less often among common folk, since they brought less profit. According to period treatises, lack of consent wasn't an issue. No one talked about love, barely even about liking, only family or crown benefit. For many women, these marriages set up lives of personal tragedy. Take Henry VIII's wife, Catherine Howard. A marriage of convenience that ended in accusations of infidelity and a beheading. Forcing people into marriage and refusing them the right of choice are exactly what modern law defines as violations of basic rights. Property confiscation without trial, when everything could be taken overnight. Imagine, tomorrow, your home, land, business, everything you've worked for could become crown property. In Henry VIII's England, this was no abstraction. The monarch could confiscate possessions on mere suspicion of disloyalty, heresy, or conspiracy. There were often no formal procedures at all. The mechanism was simple and cruel. A single letter from a snitch, a hint of suspicion, and someone's fate was settled behind council doors. Refusing to support the king's latest reform could lose you not just your office, but leave you penniless. They took land, valuable 7 household goods. The official reason? State protection. So many people were ruined this way that it created a whole new class of impoverished aristocrats and merchants. Henry VIII was notorious for seizing land from monasteries. In 1536 alone, dozens of major abbeys were secularized, their property moved to the royal treasury. The level of violence and injustice set records, even for the Middle Ages, Historians now call it an economic catastrophe for thousands of families. If someone survived the initial confiscation, there was almost no hope they'd ever get anything back. The king does not make mistakes, said royal decrees. Any attempt to appeal was another crime. Many nobles and merchants tried hiding wealth or faking deals, but the snitch system punished that too. Fear became the main tool of government. Archival sources show nearly half of all treason charges resulted in a whole family's ruin. Someone who had dined at court one day could be on the streets the next, with nothing to their name except someone else's envy or palace intrigue. This tradition peaked whenever Henry needed funds for a war or a new reform. Ruining people en masse was a way to fill the treasury, discipline the elite, and get rid of rivals. Those not killed were left destitute, without hope for rehabilitation. Today, in developed countries, we have the right to property, the right to a fair trial, and the presumption of innocence. 16th century England offered none of those. Even asking for mercy was seen as admission of guilt, and the motive to protect your own rights at someone else's expense is closer to the present than we'd like to admit. The loved ones of enemies of the crown immediately became targets and lost everything's, even their name. Fear escalated so much that London was a city where you kept quiet about your past, in public or even at home. The cult of secrecy and snitching took over families. Yesterday's elites became paupers overnight, all thanks to someone's envy or schemes. Forced religious conversion under threat of death, faith as a deadly trap. The darkest tragedy of this era was turning faith from a matter of conscience into a question of life and death. Under Henry VIII, this became the norm. The struggle between Catholics and Protestants, known as the English Reformation, led to widespread forced conversions and mass executions. In 1534, the king broke with Rome and demanded that everyone swear he was now head of the Church of England. Anyone who refused peasant or archbishop was executed. The most famous victim was Thomas More, the king's former chancellor, who refused to sign the new oath. In July 1535, he was beheaded before a crowd. Religious conversions were almost never voluntary. Loyalty to the king was checked in homes, churches, and on the street. Anyone who refused to join new liturgies or publicly reject the pope was marked as an enemy of the state. Hypocrisy for the sake of survival was what people called the forced acceptance of new beliefs. Modern historians debate, was the radicalization of faith a result of Henry's personal beliefs, or just a cynical power grab? Archival documents suggest it was both, his personal desire for control and a sense of state expediency. Anyone persisting in old faith was hanged, quartered, or burned. Executions became public theater. Even after a temporary lull during Queen Mary's reign, the punishments returned with Elizabeth. There's a myth that ordinary people could quietly practice the old faith if they stayed out of politics. But in reality, mass surveillance and hearings made society live in constant fears. Niching on a neighbor was the norm. Some of the best surviving micro-scenes are from city dwellers' diaries. At night, the guards knock, demand you swear on the new Bible, or get arrested without explanation. Sometimes people were released rarely, and only if they found powerful friends to intervene. Usually being taken away meant certain death. Forced conversion was, in fact, execution for faith, under the guise of saving one's soul. In 1536 alone, dozens of monks who refused to accept the new religion were executed. The machinery of state fear left no room for personal choice, crushing the very idea of a spiritual life. The main lesson: faith ceased to be a personal choice. It became an obligation, and breaking it was punished more harshly than any crime. Medical experiments without consent, blood and knowledge in the name of progress. Physicians at Henry VIII's court were a special breed. On one hand, they were treated with great respect, their services sought by the nobility and the monarch himself. On the other hand, medicine was only just emerging from the shadows of alchemy and superstition. Testing new methods often fell on those who had no say: prisoners, the poor, and women in charity hospitals. Medicine at that time teetered between science and sheer cruelty. There are records of court physician Thomas Vicker, who experimented with bloodletting on dozens of patients, none of whom had a say in the matter. In one case, out of 9 people subjected to extensive bloodletting, 2 died within a week. There was little sense of tragedy or error, doctors wrote. They were just unlucky. One court favorite was treated with a mixture of mercury and powdered rhinoceros horn for a fever. She died within a day. No one was held responsible. There's even a surviving letter from the royal healer. Every experiment brings knowledge for future victories over disease. Medical historians, such as Robert Porter, point out, patient consent in English hospitals was considered unnecessary. Prisoners, the poor, even students at medical schools, became test subjects without knowing. Some accepted it as their sacrifice for the greater good, fearing other punishments if they refused. The hopelessly sick were often treated even when there was no hope of recovery. Cruel procedures, like pulling teeth without painkillers or making people swallow sharp objects to cleanse the body, were routine. Medicine advanced through trial and error at the cost of broken lives. The most common treatments included cutting away large amounts of tissue without antiseptic, cauterizing wounds with boiling metal, and mysterious powders to remove bad blood. Modern society is horrified even by minor breaches of medical ethics. But in the 16th century, a single life mattered only as part of the family and the state. Only a handful of mavericks, like Surgeon John Hall, who advocated giving the patient a say, ever protested. The cliché that medicine was barbaric is only partly true. There were dedicated and honest healers, but the view of the patient as a test subject wouldn't die out. There was no right to informed consent. Even among the elite, no one asked too many questions. Death during treatment was blamed on God's will. Selling offices and bribery, royal corruption. Becoming an official at Henry VIII's court was almost like winning the lottery. Offices were given not for merit, but for hefty sums, gifts, and favors. Secretary, treasurer, judge, you could buy these posts for what today would be millions. For anyone hoping to join the inner circle, they had to invest serious money, sometimes even bribing leading ministers directly. It worked simply. The royal office took donations in exchange for jobs, which came with the right to tax, collect fees, even arrest or execute. Later, the successful candidate made their investment back via fines, taxes, and more corruption. One favorite trick was making the right to accept bribes official. For example, whoever took over as master of the mint paid a special fee to the king, then immediately charged every merchant in town for licenses or faster paperwork. The whole system was so brazen, people wrote openly about how much a post would cost, or how fast you could buy a decision. Historian David Starkey says, fighting corruption was seen more as an attempt to mess with the system than fair play. The relevance here is obvious. Shady economics and ill, scratch-your-back deals are centuries old, deeply rooted in human nature. Parliament was just beginning to exist. Officially, power was divided among those who could pay the most. If someone was actually caught in the act, usually they lost their post, at worst. The myth of pure royal power vanishes when you look at court records. Legal documents are full of accusations that Henry's rivals bribed their way up, but no one dared accuse the king or his favorites. Picture the scene. A courtier brings a golden goblet to the person in charge of building permits. There's a line at the door. Some want trade licenses, some a tax break. It's just another day at the Tower or Whitehall, and all of it feels like natural parts of the system. Persecution and executions for witchcraft. Witches in the crosshairs of the law. Being accused of magic became deadly, not only for peasants, but for women of the nobility too. The era of Henry VIII was the high point for show trials on witchcraft. Sometimes all it took was a rumor to wind up on the gallows or the fire. The legal process was brutally simple. Any tip about a witch-botched medical treatment, bad luck with farm animals, could trigger an investigation. The accused were tortured until they confessed. There's a documented case where, out of 23 women accused of using cursed herbs, only one was acquitted, the rest died. Proof was based on superstition, the presence of a witch's mark, suspicious medicine, or being too educated for your status all could suffice. Here's a question. Are you ready to believe that an odd habit or a neighbor's suspicion could cost you your life? Women in lower social classes, widows, single or simply unpopular, face the greatest risk. Professor Alison Rowe, in her work Magic and Power under the Tudors, notes, witches were often scapegoats in family or community disputes. Executions were public, sometimes even crowd events, with confessions beaten out under torture. The idea that witch burnings were just a European thing isn't true. In 16th century England, dozens were executed every year for witchcraft, men as well as women. Some counties even had witch hunters paid for each find. Picture this typical tragedy. A weeping woman on the public square, the crowd shouting, a judge reading accusations based on gossip, and a child forced to confirm the neighbor's stories. The end is already set, no defense ever helped. As a result, the fear of being labeled a witch was burned into women's consciousness. The threat of execution for being different became the ultimate tool of state control, especially over women. Forced betrayal of loved ones, fear above loyalty. There was no such thing as private trust in Henry VIII's England. Anyone could be called a traitor for an overheard whisper, a suspicious look, or an unlucky word. State-sponsored fear seeped into every home, so much that parents, children, and spouses were afraid of each other. Official directives required everyone to report anyone suspected of heresy, treason, or disrespecting the king. If you failed, you were at risk too. Rumors, gossip, anonymous letters, it all counted. The scariest part, snitching was not only normal, but sometimes seen as an act of love. Better to warn the authorities than lose your neighbor entirely. Records show stories of children betraying parents. In 1537, a young nobleman reported his mother's Catholic beliefs to the council. She was tortured, while he was praised and given a small favor by the king. In another case, a wife turned on her merchant husband after finding hidden writing. Her suspicion of his loyalty was enough. Snitching broke families and trust even in the strongest dynasties. The real tragedy was that the threat of punishment for not reporting forced people to make false choices between family and safety. Today, courts treat family testimony with suspicion. In Tudor England, it was the most prized and irrefutable evidence. Forcing a child to betray their father or mother would cause public outrage today. In the 16th century, it was called patriotism, loyalty to the monarch. A climate of suspicion shaped everything. Whispered talk, avoiding dangerous topics even at the dinner table, deliberately distancing yourself even from friends in trouble. The heroic snitch stopped being mythologized over time, as people realized it was a social disaster. Historian Leslie Smith says, "This forced betrayal explains why no uprising ever stayed secret. For long too many people were scared not to report important news." Picture the scene. A teenager stands before the judge, being made to say whether or not his father knew about the Protestant books in their house. A moment's silence and a nod. The family's life changes forever. The cycle of suspicion never breaks. Public humiliation in the stocks. Shame as state weapon. If torture broke the body, the stocks destroyed the soul. Public humiliation was used even more often than executions because it was cheap, easy to organize, and just as effective. The stock's special wooden frames with holes for the head and arms or legs stood in town squares and markets. People were locked in, their faces forced toward passers-by. Spectators would taunt them, throw rotten vegetables or mud, insult or spit on them. Sometimes, a single day in the stocks left worse injuries than a night in the cells. Why did this work? Because public shaming was a state act. Authorities proclaimed, "This person lied, deceived, broke the rules, watch them suffer." The fear of becoming an outcast was so strong that sometimes people begged for jail instead. Contemporary eyewitnesses describe how, after such punishments, ex-offenders couldn't get work again, their families lost respect, and their children were bullied at school. Picture it, a former craftsman slumped in the stocks, unable to raise his head, as the crowd, the very people he once knew, laugh and mock. Even small violations, selling without a license, paying taxes late, quarreling with a neighbor could land you in the stocks. The system was especially brutal. The state set citizens against citizens, rewarding collective scorn as public discipline. Now, such acts are called cruel punishment and a violation of human dignity. But in Tudor England, shame and being an outcast for life were the main deterrents. The psychological effect lasted years, debunking myths about medieval justice. There are some ideas that seriously distort what life was actually like in Henry VIII's England. The first myth, life was lawless and anarchic. In reality, laws and punishments were strictly regulated and cruelty was institutional. The second myth, everyone was tortured or executed. In fact, most victims were those whose suffering helped the state, political opponents, suspected heretics, or the vulnerable. A third myth, everyone was illiterate and backward. Education was limited, but the system was methodical. Laws and verdicts were carefully recorded and catalogued. The royal office kept track of every case. Monarchic control was all about bureaucracy. A fourth myth, cruelty was inevitable because it was the Middle Ages. Historian Edward Hall points out, many of these practices rose in waves during times of conflict, personal power struggles, religious fighting. In times of peace and growth, they were much less common. What the reader should take away. Henry VIII's court is not just a story of cruelty, but a warning. Absolute power, with no social feedback, is always at risk of repeating these same abuses, just in new costumes. Public punishments, snitching, religious oppression, or leveling shame at those who are different. These repeat through history, just in new forms. The most important lesson: societal awareness, openness to debate, and the defense of individual rights, even in tough times, are what keep us from repeating these mistakes. Studying the past vaccinate us against repeating error. Here's something to think about. Which of our everyday behaviors might seem just as wild and inhumane to future generations, just as the witch hunts or public shaming does to us now? What shocked you most about these practices? Let us know in the comments. If you found this story useful, subscribe so you can keep learning about the present through the lens of the past. Conclusion: why we must remember the dark pages of the past. Henry VIII's court is like a laboratory that concentrates all the passions, fears, and temptations of absolute power. Look closely at these paradoxes from history. Why were customs that we now treat as absolute crimes not just tolerated, but necessary and prized? What's most striking is how quickly norms shift. Alongside cruelty, executions, and humiliation, this era also saw the birth of modern law, the advent of appeal, and first cases of mercy petitions. Society could be both savage and reasonable, mixing torture and debate under one roof. This tension is what makes the Tudor period so instructive. The limits of the acceptable are always a product of the times. Don't forget, every generation thinks its own values are the only possible ones. For most of Henry VIII's subjects, a public execution was not only punishment, but a binding ritual for society itself. Even betrayal, something that wrecks families, was seen as an act of civic duty. Without it, people thought, the state would collapse under heresy and conspiracy. Comparing their time to today's is vital. It makes us see how nothing is fixed, not even our attitudes toward violence, justice, and rights. If even one of these practices came back now, society would reject it instantly. There would be outrage, protest, and lawsuits. But there is a warning. Every time leaders rewrite the law for their own benefit or open a door for tough measures in the name of order, there's a risk of falling back into the same twisted logic. Humiliation as discipline, execution as deterrence, betrayal for society's health. It's no coincidence that the language of Tudor law lives on in debates about freedom, rights, and government limits. So, remembering the past isn't about guilt. It's about vigilance because boundaries erode whenever a crisis hits. Stories of medieval inhumanity matter not for their shock value, but as a mirror, showing just how thin the line is between civilization and barbarism. Think about it. Which of today's normal routines, bureaucratic habits, social trends will horrify our descendants? Which of today's invisible cruelties will become the shame of future generations? Thank you for your curiosity about the events that shaped modern Europe and for your willingness to question the unquestionable. Support our channel by subscribing, let us know which historical traditions you want to explore, and share this piece with anyone who values real questions and a sober view of the past.